perspective. What do we mean by perspective? And what impact does perspective have on your life? Well, for me, perspective is the way in which you look at things. And that's going to be coloured by your beliefs. Because everything we see, everything we experience, we filter through our beliefs. Mm-hmm. And those beliefs colour the way in which we interpret things. Perspective is all about interpretation. Mm-hmm. And as you'll know, that interpretation can be very different depending on where you're sitting.
Yeah.
So we're currently looking at the camera, and behind the camera, you won't be able to see this, I have an internal courtyard, which at the moment is pretty colourful because it's full of summer flowers. However, if I stood with my back to the window and the door, what I would see is a green settee, the one you can see behind us, mm-hmm. a cream wall and a mirror. My perspective would be very, very different. Same room, but in a different position. Now that's very true of every experience that we have from the moment we're born until the moment we die.
Yes.
Our perspective colours the meaning we make of things.
Yeah, very much.
Now, those of you that have listened to us before, but by the way, I do apologise, I didn't introduce to you Rachel Davidson, who is my good friend. And just to carry on with the introduction, we're both international best-selling authors. I'm an empowerment and relationship coach, and I work strategically with businesses getting the best out of people. So let's get back to perspective. Why was it important that I introduced us? Well, your perspective will be coloured by what you know about us. Two women sitting on a green settee. Mm-hmm. What do we know? Mm-hmm. But when you start to put in between us, we've got over half a century of experience. Oh, that's a bit worrying.
That perspective's a bit worrying.
It is. That we bring a whole range of experiences to this conversation. Mm-hmm. Then your perspective is likely to shift.
Yeah.
One of the things that I think is important to set in place is the understanding that 95% of our thinking is habitual. Mm-hmm. It doesn't cross our conscious mind. It's done automatically.
Yeah.
And that's partly to protect the brain from all of the range of information that it receives in any given moment.
Yeah.
It can't possibly process it all. Mm-hmm. And so we have a system where much of the information is automatically processed.
Falls into funnels. Yeah.
And that's based on our beliefs about things.
Yeah.
And one of the things that will make a huge difference is whether your belief is that the world is friendly, mm-hmm. or the world is an alien place full of danger.
Yes.
Whether you believe that people are intrinsically good,
mm-hmm.
or whether you believe that all people are a threat. Mm-hmm. Now, I've used extreme examples.
Yeah.
But there's nuances in everything that we believe.
Yes.
And that's set up by our upbringing. Some of it's about our intrinsic wiring.
Yeah.
Whether we're optimists, pessimists, and so on. Mm-hmm. So I'm going to give you a few examples before we start to look at the impact that our perspective can have on our lives.
Yeah.
And usually I give a couple of examples, and I'm purposely choosing extreme examples.
Okay.
So imagine you're sitting in a railway carriage.
Right.
There is a family, well, a father and two children further down the carriage. Mm-hmm. The father is sitting very quiet, doing nothing.
Right.
The children are jumping all over the chairs, they're swinging from the poles, they're shrieking and making a lot of noise. Mm. What would your initial perspective be?
How annoying. Why doesn't that parent control his children?
Absolutely. What if I just said to you that that guy has just come from the hospital, mm-hmm. and he's just got the news that his wife is terminally ill and has got 2 weeks to live?
Mm. Okay, now I feel foolish for judging him so harshly.
And that's the issue, that so often we have no idea of what's going on. Mm. Let me give you another example. You're walking down the street, mm-hmm. and somebody that you know really well completely blanks you.
Yeah, yeah.
It's quite possible your initial reaction would be, oh,
what have I done to her?
Or, she's in a mood.
Yeah.
But what if I said to you that she'd just been to the vet and had her beloved dog, who'd reached the end of its life, put down.
Yeah.
Now, I'm using extreme examples, but actually we make meaning of every interaction.
Yes.
One of the most common things I find is that when people feel they've been ignored, they make it all about them.
Yes.
When the reality, I believe, is that most people are just busy doing their stuff.
It's so interesting, isn't it? I had an example last night where I got texted by a friend, and so I had a little conversation. And actually, in the week prior, she'd been posting stuff on social media about her fantastic holiday in Cornwall and how she was having a lovely lunch here and there. And I was in the moment thinking, oh, lucky her, she's having such a lovely time, and and then when actually last night she texted me to say how was I, we had this conversation. It turns out actually her parent has been in hospital, and she's very worried about that. She's got all of these other worries that are going on, and I realised that I had made massive assumptions about her state of life and where she was, just on the basis of a couple of really lovely days in a lovely place.
Yes.
And I totally sort of forgotten that she was a 3D person with lots of other things going on, and that, I think that's the crux of the negative issues around social media, is that if you're not careful to actually consider what's behind it, you only see a very, very thin veneer of somebody's life.
I think social media, emails particularly, are a place where perspective has huge capacity to be skewed. Think of the number of times when I go and work with businesses where there's been a problem created because somebody sent an email or a text which has been misinterpreted.
Yes.
And sometimes it's all that's missing is a comma, which has changed the whole meaning of the sentence.
Yes.
Or it's just that the person has been in a hurry and has not explained the backstory.
Yes, yes.
And so I think we live in a time when communication has never been easier, but it's actually never been easier to miscommunicate. And I think we have to be very mindful of that. I find it interesting how many people, their perspective polarizes things.
Yeah.
So either it puts them in a bad light, that they're always doing themselves down, and that they're making, the perspective is, I've done a terrible job, I've not succeeded, I've failed. When the reality is actually they could have done even better, but actually they've not done a bad job. Or at the other end, I've done a wonderful job, when actually there's quite a few holes in what they've done.
My husband really suffers from that, just to say that because he judges himself to a very, very high standard.
He has an incredibly high standard.
And that's because he achieves this, and he works really, really hard at everything he does. But because he's holding himself to a high standard, he often comes home and will describe a day at work that he feels he's failed at. And in telling me the story, he'll mention a few things about what people have said about his same day. And their perspective is completely different to his. They're describing a gratitude and a thankfulness for his manner of management and leadership. But because it's falling short of the standard he's given himself, his perspective is, I'm not doing good enough. This isn't, this is not meeting what I want to do, and so on and so forth.
And it's a two-edged sword, because at one level it can be a motivator to do even better. But what often happens, I'm not suggesting necessarily with your husband, but what often happens is that people are so hard on themselves that it becomes a demotivation. That it becomes another stick to beat themselves with.
And my daughter,
very destructive.
My daughter has that aspect to her, that she's very capable of certain things, but others she's not so. And she will beat herself up. And I try to say to her, look, in the grand scheme of your life, this person or this thing it's not really going to matter. I know it really, really matters now. But you have that saying, don't you, of
mountain, molehill.
If in 5 years' time, is this mountain actually going to appear more like a molehill to you? Well, if in 5 years' time, I'm taking the words out of your mouth, Gina. If in 5 years' time it's going to be a molehill, why don't you change the perspective on it now?
Absolutely.
Go further back, the mountain suddenly begins to look more like a molehill in the moment now.
Time and new information are the two things that have the most quick and direct, well, time is not the quick, but
No.
the thing is the shift between the perspective being in one way and the shift to the new way. The actual shift is quick. It can often take a long time to get to the point when you're ready to make the shift.
Yes.
But new information can shift things very quickly. Think back to the train. As soon as you have the information about that father, your perspective instantly shifted.
Yes, it did.
And the mountain molehill, and I ask people to think, will it be a mountain or a molehill in a day, in a week, in a month, in a year, in 5 years, at the end of your life? And if you're going to downgrade it, why not downgrade it now?
Yeah.
Alongside that, another strategy that's quite useful around perspective is, to give these things a score out of 10.
Yeah.
So, for example, I have a client who is recovering from OCD.
Right.
And the OCD was as a result of very significant abuse when she was a child.
Okay.
And one of the things one of the manifestations for her of the OCD is panic attacks.
Right.
So this works very well with panic attacks.
Okay. Yeah.
And so one of the things to do is to grade this in terms of, is this a real threat or is this a perceived threat? Because one of the problems with stress and with anxiety is it's very difficult to work out when you're in that moment what is real. Is it life-threatening? Because when you're having a panic or an anxiety attack, it really feels as if you're dying.
Yes.
Is this a real threat? Am I likely to die because of what's gone on?
Yes.
So 10 out of 10 is I am very likely to die.
Yes.
1 out of 10 is there is absolutely no threat to my physical or mental safety at all.
Yeah.
And so to grade this, so I'll give you an example. One of the problems for that client is around people smoking and the threat of the smoke actually doing her or her children damage.
Yes, okay.
And so we've talked about, in order for it to be a real threat, you've got to be in a smoky atmosphere for some period of time.
Yeah.
Walking past somebody who's smoking in the street is so unlikely to cause a problem that one could say that that's a no. And so grading it, having graded the threat, she then looks at the anxiety level.
Yes.
Do they match?
Yes.
And if they do match, well, then you've got to take action, and you've got to take action quickly to get out of that situation.
Yes.
If they don't match, and I have to say 9,000 times out, 8,999 times out of 9,000, it's not going to be a threat, then downgrade the anxiety.
Yes.
So she uses that alongside the molehill mountain test.
Yeah.
And that helps her recalibrate the level of threat.
Yeah.
And in doing so, it doesn't mean that she doesn't stop, the anxiety doesn't start, but it means that she manages it down very much more quickly than she ever managed it before.
And another perspective on anxiety and OCD is that you're being given a message.
Yeah.
It's a difficult and extreme message to cope with modern day living in, but nevertheless it is a message. There's some sort of tap on your conscious or your soul to sort of say something's bothering you and you need to give it attention.
Yes.
Because
but the right sort of attention.
The right sort of attention, exactly. Again, another, the perspective on what sort of attention is positive to me and assists me versus an indulgent and negative.
I think the attention that for people who've got anxiety is they get this circular conversation going around in their head, which says there's a threat, I can't do anything about it. There's a threat, I'm worried. There's a threat, I no longer feel in control, as opposed to there's a threat, is it real or perceived?
Yes.
How much of a threat is it? If it truly is a threat, what am I going to do about it?
Yes.
Take action, learn from it, do whatever needs to be done, and move on. Let go of the anxiety.
Because that's what self-development is. Sorry, really is constantly shifting your perspective on yourself, peeling another layer of the onion.
That's life, isn't it? That's
Yes.
the whole message around life, is
Yes.
that, when you look through the eyes of a toddler, they see the world very differently, not least of which because they're lower to the ground, but to somebody who's fully grown, who has an understanding of the potential danger. So a toddler will put their finger in a plug because they're exploring the world. They don't have any concept that that could actually constitute a huge danger, which is why young children effectively hand over their safety and security to grown-ups.
Yes. Yeah.
Then you get to the point when children are reaching the end of their elementary or primary school life, where they're trying to be more grown up. I think one of the problems of modern living is that they feel they need to grow up much more quickly than actually would be ideal, partly because of peer group, partly because of what they see on the television. But they want to rush to grow up, and they're in this place where they don't have enough experience to actually know what all the potential issues are, but feel that they are much more mature than they really are. And that's one of the challenges for parents, isn't it? Helping those children have a perspective around not making them fearful of the world, but making them aware of the potential difficulties and dangers and how they might actually manage those.
Yes, I mean, I know in dealing with my children, trying to give them a perspective on it, which I guess is at some moments could be just described as a different point of view, or have you considered these sort of things? I know that generally speaking, they're quite reluctant to move from their particular perspective, and my perspective on that has to be, in time, they will find the ability just to move away from that particular issue.
I think that's an interesting one, because I think our emotional maturity determines how ready we are to shift.
Yes.
And I don't think that's anything to do with age. Having said that, I think, of course, maturity, generally speaking, makes you more able to do that. But I know many adults who still operate from a much younger emotional standpoint. That their emotional development is sort of crystallised at the age of 9 or 10.
Yes.
And that they still see the world very much in black and white.
Yes.
I think, young people particularly tend to be quite judgmental. It's either good or it's bad. It's scary stuff, rather than the tabby cat of grey, which for most of us is real life.
There's not as conservative with a small c as children.
But that comes down, I think, to the bottom line is keeping ourselves safe.
Yes.
That's our fundamental need for control and for certainty. That we need to survive. And so, yes, children are conservative, or most children, or they're more likely to be conservative. So we put this into the context of let's look at it, perspective in terms of personal life and perspective in terms of professional life. Now, it's the same principle, but it throws up different situations. One of the things I think that's really important for us to bring up around the whole issue of perspective is the difference between people seeing themselves as a victim. Poor me, why has it happened to me? It's terrible, it's not fair. And that can be about anything. And, ultimately, if you stay stuck in the perspective that, this isn't fair, life is difficult, and it's more difficult for me than other people because it's not being fair. Of course, there are people who carry enormous loads. I think of my sister and my brother-in-law who had 2 profoundly disabled boys with life-limiting disorders, who lived, Matt lived 3 times longer than expected, and Jamie's still alive 42 years later. And yet they don't see themselves as victims.
No.
Life has been incredibly challenging for them. And yet what they've done is to get on, and their perspective is, well, our quality of life is down to us.
Yes.
If we stay in victim mode, why us, for us, we're never going to get anything out of life.
No, exactly.
And, you know, I've learnt to walk twice as an adult. I could have been stuck in the place of poor me. Having said that, I think it's important, you know, that when people are hurting, that, you know, saying to them, well, I don't want your moaning about this other person is worse off than you.
I was just going to say that often gets mentioned,
Yeah.
that when somebody's suffering something, somebody tries to console them or sympathise with them by saying things like, well, at least you, or...
Well, you know, you've got one broken leg, the other person's got two.
Yeah, it could be so much worse.
Yes.
And often I think, although it's coming from a meaningful place, it can often have the result of making that person feel you have no right to suffer. You have no right to be depressed. What have you got to be depressed about? Your life is perfect. You know, look at other people. They've got really real... And so it sort of like negates their emotions.
So it's getting the fine balance between recognising that, you know, that we are human beings. We talked about human beings living a spiritual existence. No, the other way around. Spiritual beings living a human existence.
Yeah.
And life can be very challenging. For me, the shift in perspective in terms of telling somebody, you know, you're all right when you compare yourself to somebody else who's in a much worse position, I don't think that's helpful. Both are in their own way developing through their life and managing the challenge that they've been given. I don't think it's the challenge that defines us.
No.
It's what we do with it.
It's the reaction, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yes.
And the challenge, you know, some challenges can feel very small to one person in comparison to their challenges. But of course, they develop, I do believe we would develop the strength to deal with the challenge. If you had no challenge in your life, a bit like steel would not be strong unless it was tempered by fire. So we grow in strength as we deal with life's challenges. It's why little children, the worlds come to the end when their toy breaks or they can't find their toy.
Yes.
But we learn through life to put things into a perspective. My sister, for example, she will talk about the fact that when you're expecting a baby, it's as if you're going on a holiday to Hawaii.
Yeah.
And then the baby's born and you discover that actually you've not ended up in Hawaii, that you've ended up in Holland. So the weather's not as good and it's not as picturesque perhaps, but actually over time you realise there's lots to recommend Holland. And I think there's a time frame where the perspective shifts.
Yes.
But at the same time, if you're not open to it shifting, it never will.
Yeah, I can remember when I was made redundant in a slightly catastrophic manner, and it was a very worrying point in my life. And I can remember walking the dogs up and down the village high street at that point and thinking, you know, managing my emotions by saying to myself, well imagine the worst scenario then. Where could this situation eventually take me? How would I feel about that worst scenario happening? What that would... And testing how I felt about each of them. And in that way, I managed to change my perspective on it. To you know, it wasn't that I wasn't suffering anymore because I was still very anxious and desperate to get another job and pay bills. But I just had a sense of balance about it a little bit, and a sense of self-knowledge that, well, if the worst happens, I've already sort of imagined how I might react, so I'm already sort of ahead of the game. So I just managed to calm myself a little bit. And that was all about just trying to get a little bit more of a perspective on it.
What I find interesting, particularly around redundancy, is how many people, when they're made redundant, it feels like the end of the world. Ask them 5 years later, and I bet you a large proportion will say best thing that ever happened. Because they've then used the opportunity to do things in a different way. And I think, you know, for me, I look at I was wheelchair bound for many years, but after that came a number of gifts. It takes a bit of time and a shift of perspective to see the gifts, but for me it was around the development of the whole Thriving Not Surviving programme, the development of strategies that I've used myself and with countless others that have helped them shift their perspective, have helped them deal with life in a different way. And that I would like to think I'd have done it anyway, but I don't know. But certainly I believe that was a gift that came out of it.
Yes, and of course the reality is that when we think differently, we act differently.
Of course we do.
And in our actions we create the reality, don't we? So
if you focus on lack, you have a sense that there's more lack because you're recognising it. The brain, as we've said, works habitually. So whatever you focus on, you get more of.
Well, and if you believe in the laws of abundance in that aspect of spirituality, then you believe in the fact that if you're focusing on the lack, that's what the universe is interpreting you want more of. You want more of lack.
Definitely.
I should give you more of lack then.
I mean, we've got lots of visitors with us today, and welcome. We'd love to know what you think about perspective. Let us know either through the website genuinely-you.com, or you can email us. You can let us know the comments that you make, the contribution you make, which is really important. So thanks very much for being with us. If you think about your perspective and think about the times in your life when your perspective has shifted, then I think one can recognise the potential of being open to shifting your perspective more quickly. Put it into the work context. We were talking about, how to lead people effectively, and how many people have a problem with their boss and think that their boss is useless or over-controlling or whatever. And I think one of the things I would say to people is understanding their perspective, that very often they're being put under pressures by their boss or by trying to keep the company going. Doesn't excuse bad behaviour, and I think that's really important. That when you shift your perspective from being a victim to that, and you start saying, right, how can I deal with this person differently that will facilitate a shift in the way in which the relationship is working?
But for the grace of God, go I. That's always a useful phrase in my head, in the sense that to try to understand somebody else's point of view, to stand in their shoes, possibly even walk a mile in their shoes, is actually, you're not actually that far away from these other people's reactions.
And I'm reminded of a client early on in my career, once I left headship, when I was coaching, and that was my business, and I was working with someone from the government office, Whitehall, who'd been sent by their boss, and there was a woman in her early 30s who had quite a responsible job, who was being a nightmare to this boss in that she challenged everything, and she would be asked to do something and she would do something different. And the boss recognised that this woman actually had a lot of potential, but unless she got herself sorted out, she was going nowhere. So I was asked to coach her. And I did an exercise where I literally did it with two chairs. And I asked her to sit in one chair and be her and think about what was going on in her boss and what was her perspective. And her perspective of her boss was that he was overbearing, that he micromanaged, that he was overcritical. I asked her then to move to the other chair and to imagine herself as him, and to wriggle and breathe into being him, and ask him what he saw when he saw her and her behaviours. And she looked a bit uncomfortable.
It's not easy.
And she started to shift her perspective from his position. The third thing I asked her to do was to ask her to imagine, to step out of that as a completely independent observer. And to say, what did she think was going on? And actually her response was, well, I think her boss was a guy, by the way. I think she's behaving like a spoiled brat, that she's behaving like a teenager having a tantrum, and she needs to grow up.
She was much harsher on herself then when she shifted to what she thought his perspective might be.
She went back to work, went to her boss, apologised and said, I realise I have been a pain in what's it. And I'm really appreciative of the fact that you stuck with me.
What a transformation.
Did it mean that all of the behaviours disappeared immediately? No. But was there the beginnings of a much better relationship? And then over a few months, that relationship became much, much more powerful because it was based on a much better relationship. He trusted her more, so he didn't micromanage, and she was much more receptive to the fact that he was under pressures from Whitehall,
Yeah.
and he had to do certain things that neither of them may have actually wanted or agreed with, but that was part of the job.
Yeah.
So
Fantastic.
I'd like to leave you with a challenge, actually, all of those of you that are with us today, is over the next week, be very mindful of your perspective and when that's helpful and when it's not. And when you're able to shift that perspective, and I'd love it if you were able to tell us how that's gone. So thanks very much for joining us, and look forward to speaking to you next week when we'll have another of these genuine chats. Thanks very much. It's Gina Gardiner here with Rachel Davidson. You can find our books on Amazon, on